For many years, she would wake up early, make coffee, check the day's tasks, and manage a house full of voices, footsteps, and plans. Now, the same table is still there, the coffee is still boiling in the kettle, but silence seems to have taken over the rooms. Maria is 73 years old. She has been a widow for almost a decade. Her children live in other states, and her grandchildren visit only on holidays. Deep down, she silently asks herself, "Why am I still here?" This seemingly simple question carries enormous weight, and it's not just Mary who does it. It's the question that crosses the minds of thousands of people after years of hard work, child-rearing, and daily commitments come to an end. What happens when calendars get less demanding and days get longer? What is left when the roles that defined an entire life are left behind? The answer doesn't lie in a new routine, an acquired hobby, or attempts to fill time. It's what remains when everything changes, the purpose. And purpose is not a generic idea, an invisible force that motivates without direction. It is the meaning that sustains existence. It's what connects a life to something bigger than itself. According to recent research from the University of Michigan, older people who maintain a clear sense of purpose have a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, fewer symptoms of depression, and live longer. Science confirms what ancient wisdom has already proclaimed: the soul that knows why it lives resists time better. But there is something even deeper, because more than any purpose, there is a specific, personal, non-transferable purpose. Something that does not belong to youth, nor does it end with it. Something that not even time can erase. And if you are still breathing, if your eyes still open every morning, that is a sufficient sign that your story is still unfolding. For many, old age seems like a time of closure, a time when we look back on the past and wait patiently for the end. But what if it's the other way around? What if maturity is actually the most sensitive point in life? The time when accumulated experiences, endured pains, and matured faith come together to produce a type of fruit that could not have been born before. In the Hebrew tradition, time was not seen as a line that advances until it wears out, but as a spiral that matures, that deepens, that leads the individual back to essential truths with greater depth. Thus, the years are not a loss of vigor, but a preparation for something more refined. And that something is the purpose that is born in silence after everything that seemed vital has passed. Interestingly, when we look at biblical accounts, there are many cases of men and women who achieved their greatest achievements in the mature phase of life. People who had been forgotten by others, underestimated, discarded, but who still carried a calling within themselves. They did not need to start over. They only needed to remember who had called them. It is possible that today you find yourself in a similar season, that you have already experienced losses, goodbyes, long nights in which everything seems to be on hold. Perhaps you have even thought that your time is up, that there is nothing left to offer, that the most memorable days are in the past. But if there is life, there is purpose, and if there is purpose, there is direction. The great challenge is to find this direction amidst the silence, because silence can be cruel, but it can also be fertile. It can echo absence, but it can also amplify the voice of God. And often, it is only when the noise of the world is silenced that we can hear what really matters. This is not an invitation to cling to memories or try to relive a past that will never return. It is a call to realize that the present time can still be full of meaning, even if it is different from what you knew. Not because circumstances have changed, but because the way of seeing can be transformed. The air you breathe at this moment is more than a biological function. It is a sign that your life is still necessary, that there is something reserved, not by chance, but with intention. Maybe not for crowds, maybe not on stages, but in the details, in the right words said to someone in need, in the attentive look, in the comfort, in the presence. And this has no age, it has a purpose. From here on, it is possible to walk with this new awareness, not to seek great things with anxiety, but to open yourself to what is before you, waiting only for it to be noticed. Because time, when given with faith, becomes fertile ground. And God, who never wastes lives, does not waste years either. There was a time when Moses was a well-known and respected man in the lands of Egypt. The adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, he was educated in the most refined courts of the ancient world. He received teachings from the Egyptian elite, and was educated in the language, science, and customs of one of the most powerful civilizations in history. It is believed that he lived in this period of prestige for about 40 years, being prepared, albeit unconsciously, for a role that no one around him imagined. However, an impulse took him away from that place. Upon seeing a Hebrew being mistreated by an Egyptian, Moses rushed to defend his people and, in an impulsive act, took the man's life. When the episode came to light, he fled. He left not only the palace, but also any pretense of protagonism. He went to the Midian Desert, a region to the east of the Sinai Peninsula, where he would spend another 4 decades away from the civilization that shaped him. 40 years. This is the time that Moses spent in anonymity, living as a shepherd, far from prestige, far from the voices that once applauded him. He married Zipporah, had children, and took care of the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro. No spotlight, no political role, no sign that there was still a plan for his life. It was just the silence of the desert, the sound of sheep, and the repeated footsteps on the sands of time. But it is precisely in this silence that something began to be prepared. What seemed like forgetfulness was, in fact, a process. And this is one of the biggest mistakes we can make, confusing God's silence with his absence. Because God's silence is not an end, it is a pause full of purpose. According to the text of Exodus chapter 3, around the 15th century BC, Moses had an encounter that would change everything. He was already about 80 years old when, on Mount Horeb, he saw a bush that was burning with fire but was not consumed. Curious, he approached it. And it was there, in that isolated setting, without witnesses, without a grand structure, that the voice of God echoed clearly and personally. The God of his ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was calling him again. At that moment, Moses heard what seemed impossible. God told him that he would be the liberator of the Hebrew people, who would free Israel from Egyptian slavery. And his first reaction was not enthusiasm, it was resistance. He questioned, doubted, and tried to escape responsibility. After all, how could someone who had failed, who had fled, who was growing old, and who had been erased from history, lead an entire nation to freedom? The truth is that Moses had spent so much time in silence that he no longer believed in himself. And this is a common reflex for many who live prolonged periods of seclusion, loss, or anonymity. Prolonged silence can give the feeling that time is up, that mistakes define us, that there is no longer any way to be useful. But what Moses did not know was that those 40 years in the desert were not wasted. They were preparation. In the Egyptian court, he had learned the language of the powerful. In the desert, he learned the rhythm of heaven. If there he had been taught to command with strength, here he would learn to lead with patience. If before he had mastered human strategies, now he would be guided by divine wisdom. And this preparation is silent, subtle, and often painful. The desert routine shapes without making noise. There is no applause, there is no recognition, just the constant process of being emptied of pride, of haste, of self-confidence. It is in this emptiness that God builds. By saying that the place was holy and that he should take off his sandals, God was saying, "This ground that seemed ordinary has been transformed by my presence." In the same way, that desert that seemed useless became the ground of revelation. The silence that seemed abandoned now revealed itself as the ideal space for a voice that does not compete with the noise of the world. Moses would still hesitate, still raise objections, still say he didn't know how to speak well, and yet God chose him, because God's criterion is not performance, it is disposition. And that man, shaped by silence, now had attentive ears. He was no longer the impulsive prince, he was the shepherd, attentive to the call. This story teaches us that silence is not a waste of time, it is part of the plan, and that God often waits for our hands to be empty before filling them with true purpose. Moses was only called when he no longer sought prominence, and this humility, this emptying, was what enabled him to receive such a great mission. Today, perhaps you too are in a kind of desert, in a time without great activities, without invitations, without a stage. Perhaps you feel that everything has stopped, but silence, when lived with faith, can be the place where the most important voice is finally heard, because God still speaks. And often, he speaks when no one else is looking, when the world has forgotten, and when the rush has already stopped. Silence does not nullify the promise. It can be the very ground where the promise germinates. And when God's voice finds a ready heart, it doesn't matter how many years have passed, nor how many mistakes have been made. The time that seemed lost was actually preparing someone who would listen and obey with maturity. When Moses heard the voice in the desert and understood that he had not been forgotten, a new stage began. Not only for him, but for an entire people who would be guided towards liberation. However, the journey was far from immediate. There were doubts, refusals, fears, and processes that would require persistent faith. And in this scenario, another name stands out: Caleb. Unlike Moses, Caleb's story was not marked by an extraordinary calling in the desert or by a mission announced with supernatural signs. He was a man who, amidst the crowd, cultivated a stable, discreet, and deeply solid confidence. His journey teaches us that faith does not need to be noisy to be firm, nor does it need the spotlight to be true. The first significant mention of Caleb appears in the book of Numbers, chapter 13. At that time, about 2 years after leaving Egypt, Moses sent 12 spies to explore the land of Canaan, the territory promised by God to the Israelites. All of the men were leaders among their tribes. Caleb represented the tribe of Judah. For 40 days, they traveled the region and returned with a report that would change the course of that generation. 10 spies were overcome with fear. They saw the fortified cities and the strong enemies and spread a feeling of defeat among the people. Only 2 men took an opposite position: Joshua and Caleb. They saw the same land, faced the same challenges, but their interpretation was different. While the others spoke of giants, Caleb saw opportunity. He stood before the people and said with conviction that it was possible to conquer that land because the Lord had promised. This scene is more than a difference of opinion. It reveals an essential principle: faith is not built on circumstances, but on trust in the character of God. Caleb did not deny the challenges. He simply refused to believe that human obstacles nullify divine promises. His was a courageous stance, but not an impulsive courage. It was the courage of someone who knew the faithfulness of the God who led him. Even with their courageous testimony, collective unbelief prevailed. The people wept, murmured, and rejected the idea of moving forward. As a result, that generation was sentenced to wander in the wilderness until all the unbelievers died. Only Joshua and Caleb, the only ones who believed, were allowed to enter the promised land. The wait was long. 45 years later, when the land was beginning to be distributed among the tribes, Caleb appeared again. Now, in his 80s, he made an unusual request. He did not want rest, nor did he seek quiet ground. He asked for Mount Hebron, a place still inhabited by giants and considered difficult to conquer, and he justified his request with the following words: "I am still as strong as the day Moses sent me." This statement was not just about physical strength, it was about the steadfastness of a spirit that had not wavered with time. For more than 4 decades, Caleb had kept hope alive, and that takes more than optimism. It takes spiritual consistency. Caleb's faith did not waver in the winds of loss, nor did it fade with the years. It matured. Many people imagine that faith is something impulsive, intense, and full of emotion. But faith is also endurance. It is the ongoing decision to trust, even when the days are long, even when results are slow, even when everything seems to be at a standstill. Faith that matures does not need frequent tests. It is sustained by the history of who God is. Caleb shows us that the passing of time does not have to weaken hope. On the contrary, it can strengthen it, because the years he spent waiting were not sterile years. They were years of inner construction. His mind remained firm, his heart did not harden, and his vision did not fade. When the moment arrived, he did not hesitate. He asked for the most difficult place because he knew that the same promise still stood. Caleb's conviction speaks to what many people experience today. As the years go by, it is natural to feel that certain opportunities have been lost, that strength has been diminished, that old dreams perhaps no longer have a place. But Caleb's story defies that logic. It shows that God's promise does not expire with time, that the years do not invalidate what was said, and that the faith that refuses to die flourishes even in the middle of the desert. Waiting is not about standing still. It is about remaining faithful. It is about continuing to believe, even when no one else mentions it. Caleb was that man. He did not wear himself out waiting. He did not harbor resentment. He did not lose heart in the face of delay. When the time came, his faith was complete, and that faith took him exactly where he had been promised decades before. This spiritual maturity is what makes Caleb's faith so relevant. He teaches us that time is not the enemy of faith. It is often the field where it deepens, and that there is a type of faith that does not need to shout because it has already learned to endure. This is the type of faith that turns mountains into an inheritance. Caleb's firmness of spirit sheds light on a reality that is often forgotten. There is a faith that does not weaken with time, but rather grows stronger with it. However, not all paths of waiting are followed in active expectation. Some promises, even when awaited with devotion, never seem to come true. The story of Zechariah and Elizabeth leads us to this other side of maturity, the one that persists despite God's prolonged silence. Zechariah was a priest. His wife Elizabeth was a descendant of the lineage of Aaron. Both lived according to the principles of the law and were known for their integrity and piety. Yet, they carried a loss that weighed more heavily than words could express. In their old age, they had never had children. And in a culture where fertility was seen as a sign of divine blessing and approval, barrenness placed them in a position of silent pain, often interpreted as God's disapproval, even when that was not true. If this message is making sense to you so far, comment Amen below. This shows that you are with us and helps this video reach even more people. For years, they prayed, and for years, nothing happened. The routine of serving God in the temple and living on the fringes of fulfilling an intimate desire repeated itself day after day. At this point in life, many would have given up waiting. Perhaps they had even stopped asking. But in their hearts, even if veiled, there was still a thread of hope. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, tells us that Zechariah was chosen by Lot to burn incense in the temple of the Lord. This was a privilege that, due to the large number of priests at the time, only happened once in a lifetime. It was a sacred, reserved, special moment. While he was carrying out this task, an angel appeared and greeted him with a message that seemed impossible. His prayer had been heard, and his wife would have a son. By this time, both Zechariah and Elizabeth were at an age considered advanced to conceive, and Zechariah's reaction was not one of immediate celebration. It was a matter of doubt. He asked how that could happen, since they no longer had natural conditions to generate life. It was a human response to a divine promise that seemed to have passed its time. The angel, however, responded firmly, and as a sign of the truth of the promise, Zechariah remained silent until the birth of his son. This forced silence became a symbol of something greater. For so long, God had been silent, and now he spoke. But it was also necessary for the priest to be silent in order to learn to listen not with his ears, but with his heart. Isabel, when she became pregnant, lived a time of seclusion. The experience of creating a life after so long brought more than joy. It brought the understanding that God's plans do not follow human logic. She recognized that this was more than a personal blessing. It was a sign to everyone who saw in her only someone marked by loss. The child born from this miracle was not just any child. John, later known as John the Baptist, was the forerunner of the Messiah, the voice crying in the wilderness, preparing the way for Jesus. A couple forgotten by many, but remembered by God, became responsible for giving birth to the one who would open the doors of a new era. This story brings to light a profound truth. God does not rush, but he is not late either. He works outside of our time frame, and his actions do not always correspond to the urgency we feel. But when he decides to intervene, his plans exceed all expectations. The story of Zechariah and Elizabeth reminds us that there are promises that do not blossom in youth, but in maturity, that there are answers that are not denied, just postponed, and that waiting time is not wasted time. Sometimes it is the very setting where faith is refined, pride is broken, and intimacy with God is deepened. While Caleb taught us that faith can remain alive for decades until the time of conquest, Zechariah and Elizabeth show us that even that which seems to have been forgotten by God can, in the right time, become a testimony. It's important to note that Elizabeth didn't just become pregnant. She acknowledged that her condition had been transformed so that others could see God's mercy. She said that God had removed her shame before others. This reveals that the promise wasn't just about her. It was about a generation. And this is often the case. When God answers, He answers in ways that touch more than just an individual need. He creates an impact that reaches others. Zechariah's silence, imposed by the angel, also plays a symbolic role. For 9 months he watched everything without being able to comment. She saw the pregnancy progress, felt life forming, and kept deep down what, one day, would be proclaimed with force. The moment John was born and he wrote his name, his voice was given back to him, and the first thing he did was praise God. This praise that had been held back for so long overflowed like a river breaking through barriers. It wasn't just the relief of having a child, it was the recognition that God still keeps promises, even after years of silence. And that divine faithfulness is not based on our age, but on His sovereignty. Promises that blossom in old age teach us that time does not limit God. On the contrary, time can be the stage where He accomplishes what defies our logic. Zechariah and Elizabeth, in their maturity, gave birth to more than one child. They gave hope to all who had stopped believing. The promise that is fulfilled in old age, as we saw in the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth, reveals a delicate side of faith, the one that waits, even when everything seems to have stopped. However, there are times when the issue is not the time of waiting, but the pain of failure. While some face silence, others live with the echo of their own mistakes. And it is in this scenario that the story of Pedro unfolds, a man marked by impulses, falls, and, mainly, by the chance to start over. Peter was no stranger. He was one of Jesus' closest disciples, someone who walked on water, witnessed miracles, and boldly confessed that Christ was the Son of the living God. He had passion, intensity, and a faith that moved him boldly. Yet that same intensity once led him to promise unconditional fidelity. He said he would never abandon the Master, even if everyone else did. But when the critical hour arrived, his words were lost in the night. That morning, Jesus had been arrested. The atmosphere was hostile, confusing, and full of tension. Peter, overcome with fear, was recognized by 3 different people as one of the Nazarene's followers. And on all 3 occasions, he denied it, firmly, with fear, with despair. On the 3rd denial, the rooster crowed, exactly as Jesus had predicted. At that moment, Peter looked at Jesus, and the look they exchanged was enough to make him go out and weep bitterly. Crying after a mistake is common, but Peter's type of crying reveals more than superficial regret. He cried with the pain of someone who realizes he betrayed the one he loved most. It is the pain of those who failed not because of lack of knowledge, but in spite of it. Of those who had the chance to act differently, but chose the easy way out. This is a deep pain that many carry, and often it is this feeling that imprisons people for years, that of no longer feeling worthy. After the crucifixion, Peter disappears from the scene. His voice is silent, his leadership is withdrawn. Even though he saw the empty tomb and heard that Jesus had risen, his sense of guilt still seemed greater than his faith. The one who had once been a fisherman and then became a disciple was now back in the boats. As if he were saying to himself, "There is no longer a place for me where it all began." It is in this context that Jesus meets him again. On the shores of the Sea of Galilee, in a scene reminiscent of the beginning of everything, Christ appears to Peter and the other disciples who were fishing. It is a detail full of meaning. It is not in Jerusalem, in the temple, or in a sacred environment that restoration takes place. It was in the everyday place where Pedro felt most comfortable, but also most lost. Jesus calls them to eat, and there, in front of the fire, a dialogue begins that has more to do with healing than with correction. Jesus does not confront him directly about his denial. He asks gently but profoundly, "Do you love me?" And he repeats the question 3 times, once for each time Peter had denied it. This moment is more than symbolic. Jesus was not just rescuing Peter from his guilt, he was rebuilding his identity. Each response from Peter, affirming his love, was a bridge being rebuilt. And in each of these responses, Jesus commissions him, "Feed my sheep." This shows that God's restoration is not just emotional, it is also vocational. He doesn't just heal, he sends again. Peter had seen himself as a failure, but Jesus saw him as a shepherd. He felt useless, but God still considered him essential. True restoration begins when we understand that our mistakes do not cancel out God's plan. They only reveal how much we need grace. Peter's story touches deeply those who have walked away. Whether due to wrong decisions or unresolved guilt, many people feel like they no longer have a place. They think God loves them but wouldn't use them. That can be forgiven, but not restored. However, the biblical narrative insists the same Peter who fell was also the one who later stood up before a crowd and boldly announced the message of the gospel. He was not just restored as a man, he was raised up as a leader, not because he was perfect, but because he understood the value of forgiveness. This transformed the way he preached. He did not speak about mercy in theory, he spoke as one who had been touched by it. This kind of transformation doesn't just happen to biblical characters, it's offered every day. The fall doesn't have to be the end. In fact, for many, it's precisely the turning point. Because when all human attempts fail, all that's left is dependence on God. And it's in this seemingly infertile soil that grace flourishes most strongly. Peter became a symbol that no failure is definitive when there is sincere repentance and a willingness to start over. Shame did not have the last word. Guilt did not dictate your fate. Jesus' gaze at the beginning had exposed his weakness, but the reunion later on revealed its value. In the journey of faith, it is not the absence of falls that defines who we are. It is what we do after them. And when we recognize our limits, without denying the possibility of return, we open space for God to write, with his own hand, the most unexpected chapters of our story. Peter's restoration concludes a sequence of stories where divine action not only responds to human weakness, but transforms that weakness into an instrument of redemption. Peter failed publicly, wept silently, returned to his origins, and yet was found again by the one who had called him from the beginning. This leads us to the understanding that, even when everything seems broken, the sky continues to operate in silence, shaping the invisible. At different moments along this path, we saw characters with unique trajectories, but united by a common truth, that life does not end with age, nor with mistakes, nor with silence. Moses was called when haste had already given way to resignation. Caleb held to his conviction for nearly half a century until his day came. Zechariah and Elizabeth created a promise when the years no longer promised them anything. Pedro, who thought he was finished, discovered that he could still be the voice of a new era. There is a deeply mistaken idea that the value of a life lies in what it produces in youth. However, Scripture reveals that maturity carries not just marks, but depth. There is something that only time can generate, the firmness that cannot be obtained in a hurry, the clarity that only comes after much pain, the authority that is born from experience. That is why so many of the most remarkable feats of faith occurred when appearance no longer impressed anyone. Late fruiting, far from being smaller, is often the most robust. The psalmist wrote that the righteous will flourish like the palm tree, and that even in old age, they will still bear fruit. This is not just a metaphor about resistance, it is a portrait of what God values, the faithfulness that persists when the applause dies down, the faith that matures over time, the character that endures the seasons of life. Today's world, with its fast-paced culture and cult of youth, hardly recognizes this value. In a society of immediate productivity, the wisdom accumulated over the years is often ignored. But there is a stark contrast between this fleeting gaze and the gaze of the eternal. God is not impressed by youth, nor does he shy away from old age. He does not measure usefulness by the functions performed, but by the inner disposition. Where the world sees weariness, he sees deep roots. Where the world rushes to replace, he chooses to refine. Each stage of life, whether marked by achievements, expectations, or new beginnings, is part of the construction of a greater story. No time is wasted, no pain is ignored, no season of life escapes the watchful eye of the one who draws plans with absolute precision. If there is still breath in your lungs, then there is still a mission. It may not be a grand mission in human eyes, but not all great work needs to be visible. Sometimes, the greatest impact comes in the silence of a prayer, in the advice given at the right time, in the patience with which one goes through a trial, in the silent example of someone who continues to believe when many have already given up. It is not about proving anything to anyone. It is about recognizing that one's existence, at this time, at this age, in this condition, still carries a calling. And this calling does not require perfection, youth, or physical strength. It requires dedication, It requires a willingness to live the present days with one's heart focused on that which is eternal. The stories we have covered so far of shepherds in the desert, warriors with a strong spirit, couples in silence, and repentant fishermen all point in the same direction. God continues to work through those who make themselves available. He does not cancel promises, He fulfills them. He does not reject those who stumble. He restores. He does not despise years marked by pain. He transforms them into testimony. The fruit that reaches maturity is the one that carries the densest flavor, because it was cultivated over time, wet with tears, strengthened by losses, and protected by faith. None of this is lost. Each scar becomes a living reminder that there was struggle, but also grace. There were failures, but also restoration. There was silence, but after it, a voice. And when we reach this point, after so many revisited journeys, the conclusion is not the end. It's just the recognition that life still pulses. There are still people who need to hear your story. There are still words that only you can say. There are gestures, advice, examples, prayers, and all of them can be God's answer in someone's life. You are not here by chance. And this is not a motivational phrase. It is a statement based on the story of every person who has remained alive to experience something that has not yet been completed. The time you have now is sacred, not because it is easy, but because it still carries purpose. And if there is something that can transform this ordinary day into a milestone for a new beginning, it is the choice to believe again. To believe that, as long as there is life, there will be direction. To believe that what has passed does not define what will come. To believe that time does not weaken God's plans, it only matures them. This is the faith that remains. This is the life that can still flourish. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.